Welcome, everyone. Can everybody hear me okay? Wonderful. So, first of all, thank you for joining us. I know you have a lot of choice here. There's lots of sessions running in parallel, so I really appreciate you spending the next 30 minutes with us here. And I promise I'll do my best to not make you regret having chosen this one. I know sometimes it's like hesitating between sessions, so I'll do my best to make it as interesting as possible. Don't let the title mislead you. I'm not going to talk about products all that much. What I want to do is actually talk about API security as a general concept. Where is it coming from? How is it evolving? How is the market and the industry evolving to solve these business problems? And I'll talk a little bit about how F5 is doing it, but I would like you to walk away from this session with a good understanding of what are the three fundamental principles you should look at when you select an API security solution for your organization. Those are the key things that I would like to get out of this session. My name is Bart Salas. I'm based here in Belgium. I'm heading up solution architects for F5 in the Middle East Africa region, and I'm also acting as a field CTO for this region in the world. I'm going to start with two numbers, and these numbers, as is indicated on the slide, it's a bit of an average based on industry reports. Companies like ourselves, like Akamai, like Imperva, Cloudflare, we all run international backbones where we carry internet traffic, and we all have visibility into what type of traffic runs over these networks. So these numbers are let's say, an average of the figures I found in market reports from these companies. 70% is the first number I want to talk about. What does it represent? 70% of all internet transactions today are API requests. That's not to say that 70% of the volume of traffic is internet, is APIs. Obviously, a lot of that is video traffic. But in terms of a request to get a response, 70% of those requests are actually API requests and not traditional web requests. So the conclusion there is that APIs are basically everywhere. They're on the public internet. And obviously, within organizations, there is a lot of API traffic as well. And API security is also something that people are starting to look at, not only from the external perspective, but also from the internal perspective. The other number is 40%, and 40% is the average number of all the web attacks that are targeting APIs. And that's a very large number as well. It's growing, which means that it's not going to take very long before half of the web attacks are API attacks. The interesting thing is that most organizations today, they have web application firewalls deployed to protect web applications, but only very few of them have very specific API security solutions. So that means that a problem is coming towards us, and the industry really needs to start having a closer look at API security as an industry. So these are, I think, figures that should indicate that everybody should care about API security, because it is a problem that's going to become apparent. Now, if you just look at API security as an isolated problem, even if you only run applications in your data center, as you will see during the course of this presentation, that's already a fairly complex problem to deal with. Now, people are not only running applications in private data centers. What you see here on the right is, in F5, we call this the ball of fire. It's our way of representing how the application world has evolved. Most organizations run applications in multiple environments. They have some applications in private data centers, some in one public cloud, others in other public clouds. We see edge computing picking up as well. So people are running a variety of different platforms on top of which they run their applications. And that obviously further complicates how you secure these environments, not only from an API security perspective, but from a general application security perspective. Historically, we've also seen that when people move from private data center to one cloud and then they move to another cloud, that they've been investing in point product solutions, each solving a very specific problem in a very specific environment. And as a result of this ball of fire, organizations ended up with 20, 30, 40 different security platforms to solve their needs. So consolidation is also an area that you should look into with API security. Artificial intelligence, AI, many of the sessions here today are about AI, obviously, and I will touch upon that a little bit as well. But AI is going to further complicate the business problem of API security, and I will touch upon that later on in this session. This is just an example for those of you who are not very familiar with the entire application landscape. This picture is just to show you how abundant APIs are. If you have a mobile application, and let's say this is a retail application where you have a user profile on the top, a shopping cart at the bottom, and in the middle you have things you can purchase, then what for you is a single digital experience is actually broken down into different application access controls. Because as an example, different parts of these applications might be sourced from different environments. Going back to that ball of fire that I just showed you, some part of this content may be served from a CDN, other parts may come from a public cloud. The profile could be in a private data center for GDPR reasons, whatever. So you see that all these things come from different environments. And APIs is not only for, let's say, application to application communication. Mobile applications, that's an app as well. Mobile applications use APIs also to get their content from all these different sources. So that's where, to give you an idea of where APIs are present in our daily lives. A little bit of history here. APIs, we talk about it, and especially API security is a relatively new thing in the security industry, but APIs have been around for a long, long time. It was back in 2000 that Salesforce actually introduced their first commercial APIs on their platforms, which is almost 25 years ago. So from that perspective, APIs are not a new thing. To put that into context, those of you who are into application security and web application firewalls, it's in 2003 that the OWASP kind of published their first version of their top 10 web app attacks. And this top 10 is still very much used by many security vendors, including F5, to drive developments on web application firewalls and protecting web applications. So that kind of, from those days, people have been deploying web application firewalls to protect API applications. 2014 was the first time that we saw API security startups popping up. Many of them actually came from people that worked in the military, because the military has always been a little bit ahead in terms of figuring out what are the new types of attacks coming. And many of these people thought like, this is a new attack vector that's going to be big in the future. So some of these people stepped out and they started creating some of these small startup companies, some of which many of you probably know about. Then with OWASP, same thing. In 2019, they came out with their top 10 API attacks. So just like we have a top 10 for web application attacks, there is now a top 10 for API attacks, because API attacks have some very specific nuances which you typically do not capture with a traditional web application firewall. So as you see, this is only like 5 years ago that this type of thing came out. And then more recently, and I'll come back to that later on, only last year, the OWASP also announced a top 10 LLM attack profile. So this is for large language models, AI applications, because AI applications, they present a new threat vector. And the way you interact with AI, the way you interact with LLM, think ChatGPT, you put something in a prompt, essentially you're sending traffic over an API as well. So AI will also have a big impact on how API security is going to evolve going forward. Not related to API specifically, but one thing that we should be aware of is this whole thing around agile application development. I'm sure you've all heard about DevOps, cloud native developments, etc. So we move away from this traditional monolithic waterfall model of developing code, where you would typically deploy a new application on a quarterly or half-yearly basis, very infrequent. We move to DevOps methodologies, agile methodologies, and as you can see in 2022, there was a study which showed that roughly 98% of companies have some form of agile development in their organization, which means that they have applications that have a release cadence which is way shorter than quarterly. Some of them weekly, some of them daily. There are companies who actually deploy new applications on an hourly basis. If you start doing that, that means that every hour or every day, you're exposing new endpoints, APIs, to the general public, that means that the traditional way of dealing with application security is no longer a viable model, and that has an impact to what we do as well. So in short, what OWASP does is they define the type of attacks that we have to protect ourselves against, and that's going to drive, let's say, functional requirements for API security solutions. But this whole notion of DevOps methodologies, agile methodologies, that's going to drive operational requirements, specifying how you're going to deploy these solutions, and that is currently driving what the industry calls a shift left strategy, putting the security mechanisms earlier in the development cycles and not just at the end when apps are being put into production. Here's just a snapshot of the OWASP API top 10 attacks. I'm not going to go into detail of them, but I just want to highlight a few things. If you go through this list, you will see that quite a few of them are related to authentication and authorization. This is about an API endpoint talking to another API endpoint, possibly retrieving sensitive data. For all those endpoints that you're trying to that you're trying to address, you need to protect yourselves and make sure that the right authentication and authorization mechanisms are in place. And things can go wrong during the development. Coders make mistakes. They create vulnerabilities in that sense. So that's a big portion of the API top 10 security attacks. Other things like unrestricted resource consumption. In some cases, consuming APIs can be expensive from a CPU perspective. So that means if people start sending a lot of requests, it might generate a lot of costs on you on the back end. That problem is going to be even more important once we go to AI and LLM applications. When people consume tokens in an AI application, consuming that token from a CPU perspective is super expensive. So you definitely want to keep control of how many requests are coming into your applications from an API request per second perspective. And then there's a few other ones like improper inventory management. I'll speak about that in a few minutes. Keeping an inventory of your APIs is super complex. And the reason for that is that very quick cadence of new releases that are coming out of applications. Keeping track of that from a security perspective, from an inventory perspective, is a fairly difficult thing to do, and you should take into account when you select an API security solution. Here's just a quick snapshot of a couple of typical API attacks that you can think of. Shadow, sometimes people call it zombie endpoints. These are APIs that are out there that are outdated, or in some cases you didn't even know that they were there. And what it means that if they're outdated and you don't know they're there, it means they're not inventorized. It means that your security teams are not aware of them, and it means that they're unprotected and potentially a vulnerability for people to get into your systems. So therefore, API discovery is a very important aspect of any API security solutions. You get a good idea of what type of APIs you have out there. Unauthenticated access, as you saw on the previous slide, a lot of these OWASP API top 10 attacks are addressing authentication, authorization, really protecting all your endpoints that only authorized people can access the endpoint and can retrieve the data over that endpoint. Data leaking and infiltration, leaking PII data, especially here in the European Union with the very strict GDPR laws. It's a very important topic, so you need to really take care of that. And that becomes even a more difficult problem once we go into AI applications where people are using unstructured text to retrieve that type of data over the thing. And then you have all these things like excessive number of API requests, as I just explained, or anomalies in the API payload. So you really need to look into what type of patterns do we see in these API request response flow to figure out if there is something unusual. Because if there's something unusual, it probably means somebody is trying to do things that they shouldn't be doing. So these are just a couple of examples of potential attacks that you would see on APIs, some of which you probably wouldn't see in traditional web attacks. So if you sum this up, you have this very rapid deployment velocity on the application side. Applications being deployed on weekly, daily, sometimes hourly basis, combined with a lack of visibility. Sometimes as a result of that speed, you lack visibility into what is out there from an API perspective. And then, let's be honest, API security is a relatively new area where we don't have too many professionals that are that have very detailed knowledge on it. The combination of all that is that many organizations out there have exposed themselves and have vulnerable APIs that are potential targets for attacks. Now, people have been doing certain things to try and address these attacks in the past. A very traditional way of doing it is using a web application firewall. And at F5, we have been selling web application firewalls for 2 decades or more. And we have also augmented our web application firewall to deal with some of the API security specific threats, like the OWASP top 10 that I just showed you, like some of the authentication and authorization capabilities. So some of these capabilities we have built into our WAFs, and other vendors have done the same. And that's a good thing. It's a good line of defense, but it's not sufficient because those solutions are only in line. They only see the traffic that goes from the end user into the APIs. They're not able to discover APIs that are out there unprotected. If nobody sends traffic to them, you wouldn't know that they are there. So you need solutions that can also look out of band into your entire application landscape and discover those APIs to build your inventory. The other thing is API gateways. There's many companies out there that deliver API gateways, and the main purpose of an API gateway is to steer API traffic to the right application. So it's mainly a traffic management capability. Most of them have built-in authentication and authorization capabilities, but all of them are very poor in really protecting APIs from the attacks that I just showed you on the earlier slides. So WAF solve a piece of the problem, API gateways solve a piece of the problem, but it's not the full-blown solution yet. So what is missing? The missing part is what you see on the left-hand side here, and let's come back to what I explained earlier, the shift left thing. We have companies on the right-hand side of this slide, which is really about protecting things at runtime. So this is about sitting in line in the traffic, intercepting traffic between a user, or let's say an application, and your API endpoints, providing inline protection capabilities. A good thing to do, but as I just explained, it's not sufficient to get the full visibility of your API posture. There's other companies, mainly startup companies, the ones that were created back in 2014, as I showed on an earlier slide. They sit more on the left-hand side of this slide. So they're typically operating out of band. They scan code libraries. They point to a Git repository, they scan the code, they look into what APIs are there, and they do posture checks on them. They can discover APIs across whole domains. So they're very good at out-of-band detection and posture checks, but they're not in line, so they cannot enforce any security policy. So many of these vendors have built integrations with companies like F5 who sit in line to provide mitigation capabilities. What we see in the industry now, and we're doing the same here at F5, is we see companies getting acquired. And actually, we acquired 2 companies. One is called WIP, the other is called HeyHack. These companies are both very active on that left-hand side of the spectrum, doing code analysis, doing domain scanning, and we are complementing our solution to really cover the entire spectrum from, let's say, out-of-band discovery, building your API inventory, all the way to inline protection, which we have already been doing for quite some time. And we see we're not the only vendor doing this. We see other companies in this space doing the same thing. So consolidation is something that is starting to happen in this space of the industry. So if there is one thing I would like you to go away with later today, it's these 3 things. Whenever you look into your organization and you believe you have an API security problem, these are the 3 things that I would suggest you look into when selecting a vendor to help you deal with this specific problem. It's about discovering your APIs, it's about managing and governing your APIs, and then it's about protecting your APIs. These are the 3 important fundamental pillars of any, let's say, API security solution. And the way you do discovery, if we start with that one, there's multiple ways to discover APIs. So first of all, if we look at what we do from an inline perspective, If we sit inline in the traffic, we see all traffic going to your API endpoints. And typically what you would do in a platform like this, you would load an open API specification file of the APIs that you know that are out there and that you want to protect. And then we check whether the incoming traffic complies with the specification file that specifies how the API should look like and how it should be consumed. If you see traffic that is deviating from that, you generate alarms so that people can look into it and decide, is this an API that is there that I forgot to include? Then you can include it in your open API specification. Is this traffic that should not be there? You can block it right there. But obviously, if you still have APIs out there and nobody is sending traffic to them, then this is never going to give you visibility into those. So what you also need is a solution that can scan your code repositories, look at what APIs have been coded by your developers, do posture checks on them, and then figure out if some of these are vulnerable to certain attacks, yes or no. So that is about protecting before you put them into production and getting the vulnerabilities out there before you put them into production. That is when you know where the code is. So you point to a code repository and you do the full scan. What you can also do is you can have a full domain scan. So think about f5.com. I do a full domain scan. These solutions, they will go out, they scan the entire domain, and they will figure out where all your applications are. And they will also be able to figure out where your APIs are. And then as a next step, you can start doing the code repositories, because then you can find the code repository. So these are three completely different ways of discovering all the APIs that you have in your organization. And that will help you build that inventory of applications. And once you have your inventory of your APIs, then you can start managing them, governing them. Like some of these APIs, they may have to comply with certain regulations, so you can do compliance checks. The other thing you may want to do is, because you have all the open API specification files for all your APIs, you manage this as a library, you keep it up to date, you make sure your security controls are in sync with those policies. And you can start also creating API documentation for the consumers of the APIs. So that's what we mean with API governance. And then last but not least, obviously, it's about that last line of defense, which is inline API protection. Loading the open API specification file into it, and then checking if incoming traffic complies or deviates from that open AI specification file. So these are the three fundamental steps: discovery, governance, management, and then you have, let's say, the inline protection capabilities. So let's talk a little bit about AI. When we speak about AI, let's talk about generative AI, because that's like the key theme these days. Generative AI, they're based on large language models. And very often this is about training a large language model, putting let's say a front-end application in front of it, having it interface with each other. And then of course there is also an API between that front-end application and the large language model. So it's heavily API based. It's heavily modern apps, agile methodology. So these are applications that will get updates very quickly as well. And the third thing, which is unique, well, not unique, but specific about AI applications, that we very often see them deployed in a very distributed fashion. So thinking back about that ball of fire that I showed in the very beginning, we see AI applications not being very centralized, but sometimes very distributed. And that's because sometimes people want to bring the AI application or the LLM to the data rather than the other way around. So where your data is where you're going to deploy the application. So we see distributed architectures with APIs all over the place. Now this is a slide from Gartner. We've done customer events, which we called AppWorld. And in AppWorld Singapore, we had somebody from Gartner speaking. And he made that nice link between API security and AI security. And you see again the OWASP top 10 in the middle. The APIs are the fundamentals, right? An AI application is a modern microservices application. It needs the things like web application firewall, DDoS, anti-bot mitigation. It needs API security, but it also needs these extra things, which are the LLM security threats that come through it. The big difference is that when we speak about pure API security, we talk about very structured API. You have the open API specification. You know exactly what type of fields, what length you expect, typical fixed format things over the API. Whereas with AI, LLM applications, you just have a textual description that you give to the system, which is a very different thing to process and to manipulate. So that requires new techniques to look into, and that's also how we see API security evolve going forward. Now, the trends we see in the industry, number one is consolidation. As I said earlier, there were companies that were coming from the runtime protection. Company like F5, we were in line with our web application firewall. We have enriched our solutions to provide runtime API security mitigation. Other companies like Akamai, Imperva have been doing the same thing. They come from the inline world. And then we have all these startup vendors that really come from, let's say, the new world, where they were doing this code scanning, these domain scanning things, really looking into code bases and figuring out what API vulnerabilities you have. Clearly, a consolidation is happening. I mean, I gave the example of F5 acquiring a few companies. There's other examples in the industry that happened over the last couple of months where we see other companies doing the same thing. So whenever you look for an API security solution, make sure you look for those vendors that are already starting to make this consolidation exercise. Number two is defense in depth. I would say that's the next level of consolidation, because when you look at API security as an isolated thing, APIs are also vulnerable to scraping attacks, which you typically mitigate through bot mitigation solutions. They're also vulnerable to DDoS attacks. I gave you the example. If you start deploying an AI application and somebody is trying to consume a lot of tokens, that is going to be very expensive for you to run these CPUs. That's not necessarily a pure play API security problem. That's a DDoS problem. So in order to protect these, let's say, new applications from an API perspective, invest in solutions that not just look at API security, but that cover the entire suite of web application firewall, DDoS, anti-bot, API security, etc. And then AI and machine learning, this works both ways. You have hackers are using AI today to craft more sophisticated attacks. And what is even worse, AI allows relatively ignorant people to craft very sophisticated attacks, which is only going to make the problem in the cybersecurity industry worse. What it means that security vendors like ourselves and anybody else in this building here today, we also have to invest in AI and machine learning to make our solutions more effective to try and mitigate what the attackers are doing. And then the last thing is protecting the AI applications. So the API security solutions will ultimately evolve to also deal with, let's say, the OWASP top 10, not only the API security attacks, but also the LLM attacks to keep your AI applications safe and protected. And essentially, that's the only product slide I have in this deck. That's essentially what we do at F5. We have all these capabilities combined: web application firewall, DDoS mitigation, bot mitigation, API security. We're looking into augmenting this API security solution with other technologies, like the acquisition from WIP and HAYAC, to fill some of the gaps that we had. And as such, we are covering, let's say, all these different elements that you saw on the previous slide. So to sum it all up, continuous API discovery and visibility. Get a complete picture of all the APIs that you have out there, so that you can only protect what you know, and what you don't know leaves you very vulnerable. So make sure you invest in a solution that can scan your entire domain and give you that complete visibility. Once you have the visibility, make sure you have the governance tools to manage your inventory of APIs and control it. Select a solution that not only deals with the very specifics of API security, but covers the entire spectrum of what people need to get full-blown application protection. And then coming back to that ball of fire from one of my first slides, make sure you invest in a solution that allows you to port the solution to any environment you have, whether your application is in a public cloud, in a private data center, in an edge compute environment, in a colocation facility, pick a solution that allows you to cover that entire suite of environments. And with that, I think I'm spot on in terms of time. I thank you very much for being here. Hope you find it useful. And if you want to talk to somebody from the team, some of my colleagues are in the back, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.